The legacies of Black Wall Streets, it's important for people to remember because there are so many people who have no idea that there were these vital, dynamic places where African Americans were living out their vision of the American dream, aiding opportunity and hope and progress for their communities.
June 1st, 2021 marks 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre, when as many as 300 people were killed as an angry white mob destroyed a prosperous Black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, once known as that city's Black Wall Street. But Tulsa's story is part of a larger history of segregated prosperity in many American cities.
The term Black Wall Street really came into popularity around the turn of the century. So as Jim Crow begins to really take shape and African Americans are forced into segregated parts of the cities, these communities, rise up in places like Durham, North Carolina, and Little Rock, Arkansas, Jackson, Mississippi, and people begin to notice that there are all kinds of businesses and services that grow there, and so they kind of take on the name Black Wall Street.
One of the biggest and longest lasting Black Wall Streets was in Richmond, Virginia, a neighborhood called Jackson Ward.
So the factors that led to Richmond being the cradle of Black capitalism lay in the diverse slave economy that existed at that time. So you had African Americans who were involved in not just agricultural slavery, but also in urban and industrial slavery. Then after the Civil War, you had this concentrated community of African Americans who had been working in the city, in factories and in fields and rural areas around Richmond. They just continued to build the institutions and the communities and the neighborhoods that they had begun even before the war. And then you begin to have a lot of really important financial firsts, such as insurance companies and banks, which really highlight Richmond as the first Black Wall Street.
One of the most storied figures in Jackson Ward's history was a banker and businesswoman named Maggie Lena Walker.
You cannot study Maggie Lena Walker and not be fascinated, with her. She was born enslaved in 1864, right toward the end of the Civil War. And she really saw economic empowerment of African American women as the path forward.
Walker started her banking career at a mutual aid society called the Independent Order of St. Luke. Founded in 1867, St. Luke was established to help freed slaves gain economic independence.
In 1901, she said, "Let us have a bank." And she said, "I'm specifically talking to the women here, the good women here, whose money is in this organization." And she was able to bring that vision to fruition in 1903 when she became the first Black woman bank president.
The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, later named the Consolidated Bank and Trust, was acquired in 2005, but Walker's home in Jackson Ward is still standing.
As you see around me, the homes have been restored on the outside, while Mrs. Walker's home has been restored to its full glory as much as we could, using artifacts that belong to Maggie Walker and her family.
We still get a lot of people who come in and they do our tours, and they're still amazing. Why didn't I know about her before? Why have I not heard this story before? And it is a story that has been preserved quite fully in Richmond itself, but not so much across the country. What is happening now in Jackson Ward is that those who remember the stories are coming together to make sure that they are no longer forgotten. So the neighborhood may not look as it did when she walked these streets, but the memories are still there.
In its heyday, I imagined that it was fabulous to live in Jackson Ward. Any kind of service that you needed, you could get, in Jackson Ward. And I would just say, walking into the St. Luke Bank, I think had to be a treat. First of all, Maggie Walker made sure that it was beautifully appointed with mahogany and marble. And I could just imagine a maid, a domestic, working in a white person's home in another part of the city. And she walks into the bank and she's greeted probably, by not just her first name, but she's called Miss or Mrs. And I just can imagine that at its height, Jackson Ward was an incredible experience. But then there's also the dark side, and that is that it is a segregated community. Maggie Walker accommodates segregation by really lending mostly in these segregated areas. So there, I think in the midst of this affluence and this dynamism, there's always that dark cloud of racism and Jim Crow that kind of just outside there is a world that wants to continue to treat them as second-class citizens.
Jackson Ward was a haven for Black business for many years, but like Tulsa's Black Wall Street, it too came to an end.
The difference between the end of Jackson Ward and the end of Tulsa is really a difference in degree. And so for Jackson Ward, it was more of a slow death.
A wide range of factors caused Jackson Ward's economic decline, including redlining, which kept capital out of Black neighborhoods, slum clearance, where cities razed old buildings without rebuilding in certain areas, and a highway system that cut right through the neighborhood. But the final end to Jackson Ward's Black Wall Street days came on the heels of the civil rights movement and desegregation.
So ironically, at the very time that you begin to have opportunity, at least legally, for African Americans to have equal accommodation, to be able to get, equal access to education, is at the same time that these communities have been so undermined in the decades previous. And so when they have choices to make, they, move to suburbs and leave really the most vulnerable and needy living in places like Jackson Ward. The occurrence of diminishing Black wealth has a long history in our country. I mean, it really takes root in slavery. There you have hundreds and hundreds of years of unpaid Black labor, and then being disenfranchised and their wealth being undermined in other ways. I think that we just really have to deal with this long-standing American exploitation of African Americans.
You can go to your bank tomorrow and you can say, until you as a corporation start to speak on our behalf, I want all my money.
In recent years, there's been a movement to reinvest funds into Black banks and businesses. One of the organizations advocating for this financial shift is Bank Black USA, which helps people find and invest in Black banks.
And we saw that there was this call to action for people to move their money from the larger institutions that had maybe a history of discriminatory practices and predatory lending practices, and move that money to MDIs, which are minority depository institutions.
According to the FDIC, MDIs are more likely to lend to lower and moderate income communities and help promote economic viability in these areas.
So we started researching these MDIs, and we quickly found out that Black financial institutions are undersupported and undercapitalized, right? Black banks are in decline. For example, there was like 50 of these institutions in 2001. In 2021, there's barely 20. Our solution was to create resources for people to be able to compare the banks and services, their financial health, the community impact, because we do believe that these MDIs can play an integral role in closing that racial wealth gap, but they're undersupported.
If you don't learn about the origins and history of Black wealth, you'll fall into the trap of thinking that there was no Black wealth. Take time to learn about Jackson Ward. Take time to learn about Durham. Take time to learn about Tulsa. Let's bring these stories forward and remember those times of Black excellence. And it can come again if we follow the roadmap that they set before us.